I'm Harry Glurkian, and this is Moneyball Medicine, the interview podcast where we meet researchers, entrepreneurs, and physicians who are using the power of data to improve patient health and make healthcare delivery more efficient. You can think of each episode as a new chapter in the never-ending audio version of my 2017 book, Moneyball Medicine, Thriving in the New Data-Driven Healthcare Market. Hey, Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Harry. Pleasure to be here.
It's been a long time since we've actually seen each other. I mean, I feel like it was just yesterday we were, interacting. Arshad was there, and we were talking about all sorts of stuff. It's actually been quite a few years, and you have now transitioned to a few different places, and right now you're running something called Concert AI. And so, I mean, let's just start with what is Concert AI for everybody who's listening?
Yeah, so Concert AI is a real-world evidence company. We'll spend a little bit of time breaking that down. We are very focused on oncology, hematology, urological cancers. So we kind of tend to stay very much in that space. And within the real-world evidence area, we really focus on bringing together high credibility research grade data. This usually means clinical data, genomic data, can include medical images, combined with technologies that aid gaining insights out of those particular data and that kind of align around various use cases. A use case could be designing a clinical study. It could be supporting a regulatory submission. It could be gaining insight post-approval, who's benefiting, who's not benefiting. And our whole mission in life is accelerating needed new medicines and actually improving the effectiveness of current medicines out there.
So who's like, I don't know, the user or the beneficiary in a sense of this?
So, we like to think we have a very heavily clinical workforce. We always put the patient first. So I'm actually going to say that a lot of the reason why we're doing things is that we have the benefit to be stewards combined working with provider entities of focusing on questions that matter for patient outcomes. So first beneficiary is patients. I think the second beneficiary are biomedical innovators. We're trying to kind of support those innovations. We're trying to understand how to go into the clinic. We're trying to understand how to design those clinical trials to have them be more effective. We're trying to understand how to show that relative to the current standard of care, they offer a range of incremental therapeutic benefit. A lot of medicines become improved once they're actually already approved. And so we actually spend time doing a lot of post-approval research that actually begins to improve the outcomes by beginning to kind of refine the treatment approaches. And then the clinical communities. We work very closely. We're a very close working partner with the American Society of Clinical Oncology and their canceling program. We're in a 10-year relationship with them that allows us to do work in truly high need areas. We did a COVID-19 registry jointly with ASCO that worked off of some of the data we brought together because COVID-19 uniquely hit cancer and particularly hematological malignancy patients. We do work with them in health disparities, making sure that racial, ethnic, and economic groups can be the beneficiaries of new medicines and are appropriately part of doing clinical trials, clinical studies. And then we work directly with provider communities who oftentimes are seeing the value of the work we're doing and making sure that for research purposes, we have appropriate access to data information to conduct that research.
Yeah, I want to get into, I think I'm going to hit on some of that later, but please. I just want to make sure everybody's sort of on a level playing field with some of these wonky terms we use, like, how do you define sort of real world data and real world evidence? I mean, I know what the FDA defines it as, but I'm just curious.
Yeah. So yeah, and FDA does have some publications really there that came out at the end of 2018 that actually began to lay out a framework around that, which I would encourage folks to reference. It's actually a very well-written document. So real world data is sort of what it sounds like. It's the data, right? And, if you were a clinician and if you were sitting in a clinical care environment, you probably wouldn't be using the word real world data because those are the data generated through your treatment of the patient. So, clinicians sometimes actually kind of pause for a moment and say, what's your real world data? I mean, the things I'm doing. And in fact,
Yes.
real world data would be structured data fields. And a structured fields is a lab value that may have come in from the laboratory information system, or a drop-down menu, did they smoke or not, which can be a fixed field in an EMR, all the way over to physician notes, to appended molecular diagnostic reports, to imaging interpretation reports. So all those are forms of data. Now, evidence is a little bit about also what it would sound like. So data is, data are not evidence. So,
Right.
you have to actually, and in fact, to generate evidence, I, one, have to trust the data. I have to believe those data are an accurate reflection of the source systems it came from. I have to believe they're representative or appropriate for the question that I'm actually trying to address. And then I have to make sure that the methodologies I'm using to analyze something, either comparing the effectiveness of two drugs relative to each other, actually then, when I look at that analysis, I'm willing to either make a regulatory decision or a guideline modification. And the intent of evidence is either to support a regulatory decision or something that can inform practice of medicine or nature of treatment. So that's a there's a bar there that one has to achieve to actually become evidence. But I think evidence is the right goal by what we're trying to do.
So in the past, I mean, because I've worked with companies like Evidation Health and so forth, right? Some of this data was in paper form, right? Not in electronic form. So what holes in the current system of, say, drug development would better real world data or real world evidence help fill or drive forward?
Yeah, that's a super good question. And, Harry, you were kind of going back to you were one of the primary leading individuals around that when the days of personalized and individualized and precision medicine and even some of molecular medicine kind of came around. In fact, that's probably where you were my first point of interaction. And I come back to that concept because when you're looking at data, and again, not all data are kind of created equal here. When I think about setting up and designing a clinical study, so now I'm with an experimental therapeutic, or I'm thinking about moving it in. If it worked in one solid tumor, and I suspect that same molecular pathway or kind of disease mechanism may be at work in another one, and so I want to kind of think about doing a pan-tumor strategy or something of that nature. If I can bring together molecular diagnostic information, aspects of the individual patients, but do it at scale and understand the homogeneity, the heterogeneity, and the different characteristics in there, I can design my trials differently, and I can make my trials more precise. And the more precise the trials are, the higher the likelihood I'm going to get meaningful outcomes. The outcomes here that are meaningful is what actually helps medicines progress. It's actually getting those questions to be as narrow and as precise and as declarative in their outcomes as possible. And so a lot of these data can actually be used to help guide that study design. Now, if I also have very rare cancers or very rare diseases, so this would apply even outside of oncology, although most of our work is oncology related. Even if I'm outside of that, and if I'm in very rare, oftentimes finding, putting a patient on a standard of control therapy, a standard of care therapy as a control, oftentimes may not be in the patient's best interest. And so this notion of either a single arm or having an external control or having a real world evidence support package as part of that may be part of what can occur between the sponsor and actually the FDA, et cetera, for kind of moving that through. But this has to be done individually around the individual program, and the program and the characteristics have to kind of merit that. But these are big deals. So we feel that these are forms of data that can complement what would have been traditional legacy approaches to give more confidence in the decisions being made and the evaluation of the ones actually coming to it. So.
Yeah, I can hardly wait. I mean, maybe it's a dream, but I'd hardly wait till we get rid of first line and second line, and we just say, okay, look, here's a battery of assays or whatever. This is what you should be taking. First line and second line. I mean, these are sort of, in my mind, almost arcane concepts from because we didn't have the tools in the past, and now we're starting to move in that direction.
Yeah, so Harry, just to maybe to build on that a little bit. So if you look at some of our publications and things that we presented at this last ASCO, there's work one can do when you look at different features of patient response, et cetera. We're a company, but we also have a very strong data science backbone to what we do in AI and ML application. There are features that sometimes you can predict metastatic status, you can predict rate of response, you can predict progression. Now, the very fact that I can make that statement kind of indicates that as you start thinking about the paradigm in the future, particularly when I start doing liquid tumor biopsies and surveillance mechanisms where I can see response much more rapidly in less invasive ways, you're going to start, even over the course of this next 5 years, I think some of these will start influencing practice patterns in some very positive ways for patients. So.
From your lips to his or her ears, like it needs to move faster. But
some of
it's interesting, right? Yeah, I mean, but your history is I mean, I feel like you've been on this path for quite some time. Like I want to say at least since your book in 2016, if not before that.
Yeah, so, yeah, you and I interacted first. I think we were kind of in the hallways, first interaction of what had been the Necco Candy Factory on Massachusetts Avenue in a Novartis building where I was working in the Novartis Institutes of BioMedical Research at the time. And even prior to that, I think I did my first work back in the days of Millennium Pharmaceutical, when it was still a standalone company doing work in precision medicine and personalized medicine all the way through. And obviously Novartis's strategy was looking at pathway biology and actually using that as the basis of actually understanding where in a pathway system one could actually target, and actually understanding that it is a system. It's got redundancy, both in a bad and a positive way. How do we use that to progress new medicines? So there's been aspects of this that's always been kind of a little bit apart. I think I kind of made a decision to kind of pivot much more to a large scale, data-centric, insight, technology-centric approach, and actually at scale, bring some of that back to the biomedical innovators. But yeah, it's been a progression over time, and some of this, it's a field that I feel strong passion around, and will stay committed to for the duration of whatever my professional career looks like. So
yeah, so can you give us maybe an example? I mean, I know some of it may be confidential, but how does the data that you're providing, say, improve maybe drug safety or effectiveness?
So, we're doing a project right now that's safety related, and I'll try to keep it such that I'm not betraying anybody's confidence. Eventually, this will be in a publication, but it's not at the point yet. We're looking at a subpopulation that had severe adverse events, cardiac adverse events in the population. And originally, the hypothesis was relatively single homogeneous group. And we brought together some of our deepest clinical data, which means we have many different features of intermediate measures of disease progression, response, adverse events, severe adverse events. And we also brought some of our data science and AI solutions to it. And one of the major insights that came out of that is it actually wasn't a single homogeneous group. One group was characterized by having a series of comorbidities that then linked to this significant adverse event, and the other were purely immunological based. And so therefore, actually in both cases, they're screenable, they're predictable, they're surveillable and monitorable. And so therefore, but the actions would be very different if you didn't know what the two groups are. So in this particular case, we could discriminate that. Now we'll take that into more classical biostatistical analysis and do some confirmatory work on that. But that has significant implications on how you're going to kind of screen a patient, survey a patient, to look for whether or not they exhibit that area, and how you would kind of handle and manage that. That would improve the outcome significantly of that subpopulation. So that's one example. In other areas, some of our data was actually being used as part of a regulatory submission. It was a very, very rare population in lung cancer, and it was unclear exactly how non-responsive they were to the full range of current standard of care. And we were actually illustrating that there was almost a complete non-response to all current medicines that were actually used against this particular molecular target because of a submutation. And that actually was part of the regulatory submission. And that program both actually got breakthrough designation status, and that actually supported that, and actually got an approval ahead of the PDUFA date. So when you start pulling some of these pieces together, they work to, again, provide more confidence in interpretation and more confidence in decision-making. And in this particular case, certainly accelerated medicines being available to patients. So.
Oh yeah, yeah. Drive value for patients and drive value for the persons, the people that are using the capability to get the product through.
Absolutely.
So, we're talking about data. At some point, you've got to turn this into a product or a service of some sort, or maybe a SaaS, as you guys might look at it. But you've got something called, Eureka Health, right? In your product lineup. Can you give us an idea of what that is? I think it's a cloud-based SaaS, product, research. You call it research-ready real-world data. So I'm just curious how that works.
Yeah. So we do think. So if you think about what we're trying to do, is we're trying to allow a level of scale and a level of precision and depth on demand in the hands of individual researchers, from translational scientists, folks in clinical development, post-approval medical, post-approval medical value and access, kind of in that domain. And so each of those have different use cases. Each of those have different kind of demands that they'll place on data and technology for kind of doing that. But because we're trying to move away from the world of bespokeness, because by nature of bespokeness, the question has its own orientation. The data is just unique to the question, and its utility later is very low. And, in a way, what we'd rather do is, what have we learned about what actually kind of creates utility out of data? And let's make sure that we're covering the use cases of interest, but let's do it at very large scale. And that scale itself, and the data we even represent at that very large scale, is in itself representative and actually has significance, whether it's on a prevalence basis of subcohorts of disease or not. Now, the reason why I'm spending so much time developing that is, when you put that in the hands of the right people, you're avoiding bias, but you're also giving utility at the same time. And so you're actually improving their ability to conduct rapid question interrogation, but also structure really good research questions and have the discipline about good research methods around that. So we do structure those as products. And so actually one of the things we think of is, the work that I do in non-small cell lung cancer is an extremely large data set that also has high depth on the molecular basis of non-small cell lung cancer. And it's created in a way that actually allows you to make those questions from translational through post-approval medical and doing that. Eureka is the technical environment. It is a cloud environment. We kind of work it, and it actually allows you to do on the fly actually insights. So there's outcome curves, which called Kaplan-Meier, and a few other measures. I can compare groups, I can compare cohorts, I can ask questions. It's actually exceptionally fast. And so this ability to navigate through a series of questions, this ability to make comparisons of alternative groups of patients on different classes of questions and finally get down to the patient cohort of interest that you may want to move into the next phase of your research is done a lot faster. Now, we took that, and now we're integrating more AI and ML into that. So we now have created probably what's one of the leading solutions for doing clinical study design. So we can optimize different features of that study design. We can actually release lab values. We can change parameters. There's a level of kind of fitness, ECOG scoring. We can actually modify that and show what the changes would be in the addressable patient population, and actually optimize that study design all the way down to the base activity level. And we're basically creating a digital object that's rooted on huge amounts of data underneath it. 4.5 million records runs inside that particular area. There is no other solution in oncology, hematology that gets anywhere to that depth of information that can reflect on with different optimization to the endpoints and even reflect statistical power. Now we're integrating and work even around health disparities. How do you assure that if it's a disease like multiple myeloma, which may disproportionately affect Black Americans, that I'm actually getting adequate representation of the groups that in fact actually may be afflicted by the disease, and actually assure the design of the study itself assures their representativeness actually in that work.
So this data set,
Yeah.
What are some of the features of it? What is it? What sort of information does it have in it that then you would be pulling from? Because my brain is like going on all sorts of levels that you would pull from, and some of it is incredibly messy.
Yeah. So you are absolutely right, and so there have been expressions in the field of people who do, work in real world data that the real world's messy. Fields may be empty. Do you know is an empty field because nothing got put there, or is the empty field because in that electronic medical record environment, empty means it was not true of the state of the patient? That may sound like a nuanced thing, but sometimes empty actually is a value, and sometimes empty is empty. And so you start getting into some things like that, which you start thinking about, like, those are pretty nuanced questions, but they all have to do with, if you don't know which it is, you don't know how to treat and move the data through. So back to your question here a little bit, the sources of where we bring data from are portions of a clinical record. So, we work under businesses. The work we do is either research or quality care focused. And so, we work actually, whether it's with the American Society of Clinical Oncology, et cetera, appropriately under all HIPAA guidelines and rules for how you interact with data around doing that. So I'll put that as a caveat, because methods and how you do that, security and everything else, super, super important. We have a clinical workforce. These are all credentialed people. Most of them have active clinical credentials. Most of them were in the clinic 10 to 15 years that even still interact on it. So a lot of my people feel they're still in clinical care. Just happens to be a digital representation of the individuals that are in there. And we're seeing whether it's features of notes, depth of the molecular diagnostic information, radiologically acquired images that may show how the tumor progressed, regressed, et cetera, that's in there. Any other the medications, prior treatment history, comorbidities that may come found, actually response. So all those different features are brought together. But if you don't bring it together consistently, we have tens of thousands of lines of business rules, concepts, and models that we try to publish around about how you bring a concept forward. So if you want to bring a concept forward, you want to do it consistently, we come out of 10 different electronic medical record environments, and we're actually interacting with the work of 1,100 medical oncologists and hematologists, et cetera. You have a lot of heterogeneity. So we have to handle that heterogeneity with a clinical informatics team into a set of rules as it's coming forward, so that everything comes to the point that you can have confidence in that, in that particular analysis and that presentation. So there's something called abstraction, which is a term applied to unstructured data, and unstructured just means a machine can't read it on the fly. And so we're actually interacting with that, which could be a PDF document or something else. And from that, we use the business rules to then develop something that now is machine readable, but actually has a definition behind it that one can trust, that kind of comes from some published basis about why did you create that variable. So I could measure outcomes of interest, progression-free survival, adverse events, whatever the feature of interest to help you answer the question, we try to kind of bring through. So we're usually creating about 120 unique variables that never would have been machine readable, in addition to the 100 that probably were machine readable when we bring that together.
So you're using, you're using a rule-based AI system, maybe not just a straight natural language processing system to parse the words.
Yeah, so natural language processing gets a little tricky. We have actually excellent natural language processing. We'll sometimes use that for pre-processing, but you have to be careful. Natural language processing, if it has context sensitivity, and if
Yes.
you're parsing for sets of reliable terms, it can actually be relatively accurate. If I'm doing something like a laboratory report, that's so discrete, so finite, and it's so finite with how many alternatives you have for the same concept, it works really well. When you start getting into things that are much more nuanced, you actually start to have a combination of technology with expert humans to actually have confidence in the ultimate outcome. Now we do have some very sophisticated AI models. Like give you an example. When you're looking at a medical record, usually metastatic status is just done at point of first diagnosis in cancer care. So if the patient actually progresses and they may through that, they don't update the electronic medical record because they want to maintain what the starting point was when therapy was administered. But a biomedical researcher wants to know it at a point in time. So
Right.
we have models that can literally read the record and bring back that status at any point in the time of disease progression. Now, would that work up to the grade of, say, for regulatory submission? No, but for a rapid analysis to pull back a question of interest and have it done in minutes as opposed to weeks or months, it works exceptionally well.
Understood. Understood. So now you and I both know that clinical trials, are available only to a certain portion of the population really participate for a whole bunch of reasons. And then if you go down to sort of, equality or across, the socioeconomic scale, it gets pretty thin, right?
Yeah.
You guys, I think you've been pushing around inequality in cancer care, and you have this program called ERACE, which I think stands for engaging research to achieve clinical care equality, I think it is.
Yep.
Yeah. So, all right. Help me out here. What is
Okay.
it?
So we are, as an organization, we're super privileged to have a very, very diverse workforce. Men, women, all forms of background, races, ethnicities, and we really value that. And we've tried very hard to build that in our scientific community. And I think when the public discourse around kind of equity, diversity, inclusiveness came forward, as you know, Harry, this has been a unprecedented period of time for just about any of us. I mean, between COVID-19 and social issues and things of that nature, it's really been a very, very unprecedented time in terms of how we work and how we interact and the questions. Our organization and our scientists actually came forward to me and said, Jeff, we have a tremendous amount of data. We have partners like American Society of Clinical Oncology and some of the leading biopharmaceutical researchers in the world, and we've got technology, et cetera. We want relevance. We really want to make contributions back, and we believe that actually we can do some research that no one else can do, and we can actually begin to deliver insights that no one has the capability to do. Would you kind of support us in doing that? And so we put together the ERACE program, and it actually was named by a couple of our internal scientists. And the program actually now is being collaboratively done. We've done a couple webinars with some of our partners, and that's included folks from whether it's AstraZeneca, Janssen, and BMS, et cetera. It's become something where around how can we rethink how research takes place and actually assure its representativeness for all groups, but particularly in specific diseases, it impacts different groups differently. And so can we make sure it reflects that? Can we be generating the evidence so that they can in fact be appropriate beneficiaries earlier? And a lot of this came from when we looked at aspects of diagnostic activity, we could say that Black American women have a higher incidence of triple negative breast cancer and a few other diseases. When we look at patterns of diagnosis and activity, unfortunately, the evidence that we even have is not substantially in the practice of what we're actually seeing sometimes when we begin reviewing our data. And so We began confederating through our own work. We now have actually set up research funding. So we actually now will fund researchers who come in the academic community if they come up with research proposals that have to do with, health-related disparities, whether it's economically based or if it's racial, ethnically based. Those questions, we've got an external review board on those proposals. We'll provide them data, technology, and financial support to get that research done. We're doing it with our own group, and we're doing it collaboratively with our own kind of biopharma sponsor partners kind of as well. So for us right now, it's about confederating an ecosystem. It's about building it into the fabric about how research questions are framed, research conducted, clinical trials are conducted, and then actually those insights put into clinical practice for the benefit of all those groups. And so, it's even changing where we get our data from now. So it's like an integral part of everything we do at the moment.
So you saw, I don't want to say an immediate benefit from looking at it this way or bringing this on, but I mean, you must have seen within a short period of time the benefit of I don't want to say broadening the lens, but I can't think of a better way to frame it.
We were surprised how quickly, whether it was academic groups or others, rallied around some of the concepts and the notions. And we were surprised how quickly we were able to make progress in some of our own research questions. And we were pleased and astonished only in the best ways that we saw industry and biomedical research, the whole biomedical community, attempting to integrate into their research and the questions that they asked, actually different ways of approaching that. And in fact, it's probably one of the most heartening areas that you couldn't have legislated this as quickly as I believe leading industry biomedical innovators decided it was time to kind of change portions of the research model. And Harry, you made a statement earlier on that it's not just about kind of us analyzing data. Sometimes now you find that to broaden actual, say, clinical trial participation, I actually have to go to sites that historically didn't conduct clinical trials. I may need to have investigators that are trusted because some of the populations we may want to interact with don't trust clinical research and have a long history about why they didn't trust clinical research. So you're changing a social paradigm, you're changing research locations and capacity and capability for that research. So we're now moving research capacity out into community settings and specific community settings with this idea that we actually need to bring the infrastructure to the people and not assume again that people want to kind of go to where the research historically was conducted, because that wasn't working before either.
Well, and I believe, I mean, at some point, if you turn the crank enough, you start to influence, you should be able to influence, standard of care and
Absolutely.
All that stuff, because if you're missing data in different places, you're like, we got to make sure to fill these holes. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to diagnose and then treat appropriately.
Generate the evidence that support actually doing that and doing it on an accelerated basis, but also that it gives confidence for those decisions. Absolutely. That's part of our goal.
Yeah. So I want to jump back in time here and sort of go back to your healthcare disrupted book. I feel like, we're on the same page because it's that I think the message was, pharma, device diagnostics, healthcare, they need to rethink their business model to respond to this digital transformation, which is obviously something, in my own heart, I've been sort of, banging that drum for quite some time. No. In particular, you argued in the book, like that real world data from EMRs, wearables, the Internet of Things, could be combined to change how and where healthcare is delivered. Is there a way in which like Concert AI's mission reflects the message of your book? Can I make that leap?
I appreciate the way you asked the question. And I think if you said our principles and perspectives about that we need to kind of focus on value and outcomes, and we're going to be bringing insights, digital, cloud, and a variety of other tools to underpin how we work and operate. Absolutely. And in fact, I think Positively, I had a lot of engagement and did a lot of interviews, even as we were putting the book together, which took place over a couple, I think it was probably, you've done your own book. So, so whatever you think it's going to be, it's a lot longer. So, so I'll leave it at that. I have recovered from the process now. But I think we had a lot of engagement, whether it was with medical community, biopharma, leadership community, et cetera. And I think that alignment is some of the alignment we have with our partners today. It's actually around some of the same principles. What I couldn't have predicted, in fact, I was a couple of years ago, and this probably would have been towards the tail end of 2019, I was already starting to think about, okay, I've recovered from the first writing. How did I do? And what would I say now? And at the time, I was beginning to say certain things seemed to be taking shape slightly more slowly than I originally forecast. But then COVID-19 happened. And all of a sudden, certain things that we kind of had thought about and kind of had put there actually accelerated. And in fact, I think, out of adversity, you'd like to say we bring sources of strength we didn't know we would kind of be beneficiaries of. But out of that, you could argue this concept of, say, decentralized trial activity. So we have, let me pick I'm one company, but let me pick a parallel company that I have respect for, say, Medical, as an example. And Michelle does, the company does a very nice job, but that's the idea that everything can be done remotely. I can actually do a device cloud around the individual. I can do a data collection and run RCT grade trial activity. Now that doesn't work super well in oncology, hematology, et cetera, where I'm doing chemo infusion and I have to do very close surveillance, but that concept is an accelerated version and got broader adoption and actually was part of some of the COVID-19 kind of clinical studies and capabilities. And it's not going to revert back. So actually what happens is you find it has a level of efficiency, a level of effectiveness, and a level of inclusiveness that wasn't available before when it had to do facilities based only. Now, we ourselves we're asked to accelerate. We bring technologies and integrate them into provider settings for doing retrospective analysis. But actually during that period, not only did we bring our clinical study design tools and use AI and ML for doing that, which led to, we've supported the restart of many oncology studies now, and actually the redesign of studies to be able to move into different settings that they never were in before. And actually now we're beginning to use some of our same approaches for running prospective studies, but from clinically only derived data sources as a very different paradigm about how you conduct clinical research. So when you think about this, there are unpredictable shocks, which some may have called black swan events or whatever you may want to ascribe to it, that actually are now consistent with everything we did, but actually accelerating it and in a weird way back on trajectory, if you will. But I think, yes, everything we're doing was informed by a lot of that seminal work and research and foundation about what worked in health system and didn't, how are people being beneficiaries or not, how do we need to change how we do discovery, translational, and clinical development, and we're very committed to doing that. So.
Yeah, it's interesting because you almost answered to my next two questions, which, but I'm really hoping it doesn't slide backwards. That's my one of my biggest fears is people like to revert back to what they were used to.
Well, let me give you maybe to encourage you and me. One of the things, if you let's take a look at a teleconsult. So during COVID-19, HHS opened up and allowed as a coded event doing a digital teleconsult for kind of digital medicine, telemedicine. And that was put into place on an emergency basis by HHS. And then before the outgoing HHS head did, it's now made permanent and it's now part of the code that actually will continue to actually be a reimbursable event for clinicians. That was actually super important. Actually, during COVID-19, not that well known is not only to allow people to be seen, but hospital systems were really financially distressed because most of their work was informed by kind of, elective procedures and things of that nature, and that couldn't take place. But the teleconsult became a very important part of their even having economic viability, which you can't underestimate the importance of that during a pandemic, right? So
Right.
now that's part of how we're going to work. My personal view is now that people are using digitally screening tools, they have decentralized trials, some of the solutions that we're putting into place, AI-based, bringing RWE as part of a regulatory submission. I don't see anything going back. And the work we're doing is if we can start putting 30 to 50% time and cost improvements and add more evidence around a decision more robustly than we did before, that's not going backwards at all.
Good. That makes me, well, I'm hoping that we're all right, because we've been saying this and beating this drum.
I'll write it down. I'll record it so I can be held accountable to my.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because I don't think I've gotten over the whole writing thing, because I've got a new book coming out in the fall. So, you know,
right, you'll have to help me out on that
myself. Well, Jeff, this was great. I hope, you know, we were able to give the listeners sort of a view of where this whole world is changing, how data is changing it. I mean, I've had the pleasure of talking to people about digital twins and that sort of data. And so I believe that this, you know, we're going to be able to make predictions, as you say, off this data almost proactively. It's interesting because I do talk to some people who are in the field that look at me strange when I say that. But after working with different forms of data in different places for so long, I can see how you can look at things predictively and sort of, you know, decide what's, you know, see what's going to happen almost before it happens for the most part, if you have a big enough data set.
So we do a lot of prediction being in the AI and ML world, and we predict, you can actually be relatively accurate on who's going to adhere and not adhere. You can begin to look at the sort of biological response to being placed on a new therapy and understand whether that response is kind of in a direction that that patient's going to remain on that therapy or need to discontinue, be placed on a new therapy. And you're right. In fact, some of these features will. The question is, we use it from generating insights to design and hopefully improve outcomes, et cetera. We're a rapid process. I mean, I've seen things in the last 3 years in setting up Concert AI that would have taken me a decade to have seen in, you know, past methods, but we're still not as fast and as effective as we can be. And the very fact that I can, in my digital laboratory, if you will, create AI ML to predict whether that patient's going to be discontinued or continue on to that course of therapy, some of that needs to be brought into as confidence tools that can start to inform parts of practice as well. They're not ready for that. They have to assent to that. But when you look at these, some of these, whether it's coming in as software as a medical device, sets of solutions to augment, actually are going to add a huge, huge amount of utility. And you're finding a lot of interest. Even biomedical innovators now are looking for predictive tools to complement their medicines. And, you know, we're doing a couple things that would be definitely considered in the more confidential area around doing that right now. And I have to tell you, I've been so kind of pleased, and it's just, for me, it's so catalyzing of our energy to be brought into this, to see people willing to reshape the paradigm about how they do things that actually will reshape how medicine's delivered and care is provided too.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, you know, ideally, right? I think every physician wants to give the patient the optimal therapy, right? Not pick the wrong one and have to redo it again.
Absolutely.
But I think a lot of these tools are also going to lend themselves to adjudication.
Absolutely.
Right, and that is a huge paradigm shift for everybody to wrap their head around. And I think we're going to get pushback from some people. But it's I can't see how you don't end up there at some point. Is you can see where it's going, you know what's going to work. Here's the drug, and if it doesn't work, here's the data to show it didn't work.
Well, and actually, I heard to your point. I mean, you know, there's a fairly you know, right now, if you're thinking about how payers authorize, you know, the treatment that's proposed by a clinician for super expensive medicines, right? But if I'm in oncology, I can tell you right now that claims data as a single data source can't tell you much about what that patient response, whether they're being treated according to NCCN ASCO guidelines or not. So you're wondering, what's the basis of that? Whereas I can actually look at the data and I can understand how that patient presents, and I can see what's actually the intended treatment. And you can immediately say, that perfectly makes sense given how everything's matched up. And I can continue to kind of say, what that response is, it consistent with what I would have hoped for placing that patient on that specific treatment. So to your point, this is going to change all sorts of things, actually. So
I love it when it changes on that level. It just makes me all happy inside. So, Jeff, it was great catching up with you.
Very good catch up with you too. Thanks for the
Pandemic is
opportunity.
open. We can, get together in person and, have a beer. Maybe we'll even bring Arshad, because I think he's been working in this whole data area with a number of companies for a while now.
Yeah, would love it.
Excellent.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you too.